The last supply ship had dropped off three things that week: a crate of medical powder that smelled wrong, a broken water recycler, and a music speaker that only worked if you hit it on the left side first. Reed Calloway hit it on the left side and it hummed to life. Old music from Earth, the kind with no words, just instruments that moved slow and low like a tide coming in. He set it on the edge of the supply shelf and went back to counting bandage rolls. The outpost on Moon Verath 9 had 17 permanent residents. 12 were researchers, 4 were maintenance crew. Reed was the only medic. He had been here 8 months, and the most serious case he had treated was a broken finger and a chemical burn from a spilled sample. He was not complaining. He liked the quiet. The jungle outside pressed against the walls of the outpost like it was curious. Verath 9 was thick with life. Strange birds that called to each other in patterns that sounded almost mathematical. Insects the size of a hand. And somewhere deeper in the tree line, the Veil. The Veil were the reason most of the researchers were here. Big, scaled, moving on 4 legs with 2 smaller upper limbs that worked almost like arms. They had wide flat heads and eyes that caught light the way still water does. The survey notes called them semi-sentient. Reed thought that was a lazy word. He had watched them from the observation platform twice. They did not look semi-anything to him. The Coalition had no medical protocols for them. They were listed in the system under the category of non-priority regional fauna. Reed had looked it up once out of curiosity and found exactly one paragraph. It said that the Veil were to be observed but not interfered with. It said nothing about what to do if one of them was dying in your medical bay. He did not know that part yet. It was 3 in the morning when the bay doors crashed open. Reed had the bandage roll in his hand and he turned, and what he saw stopped him completely still for a full 3 seconds. A Veil hatchling was standing in the doorway. Small, maybe the size of a large dog with pale green scales and eyes like hammered silver. It was shaking. Its claws were dark with something wet, and behind it, dragged across the floor by sheer impossible effort, was a much larger Veil. A young adult, maybe. Long, heavy, scaled in deep gray and brown, chest rising in short, broken movements. The hatchling looked at Reed. The words came out in a language Reed did not speak, a high-clicking series of sounds that dropped low at the end. But the look on the hatchling's face needed no translation at all. Reed set down the bandage roll and crossed the room in 4 steps. He dropped to his knees beside the large Veil, and his hands were already moving before he had fully decided what to do. Scan first. He pulled the general sensor from his belt and ran it over the creature's torso. The screen filled with readings that the software tried to interpret and mostly failed. What it could tell him was heat loss, pressure variance, and the undeniable fact of 3 deep puncture wounds through the chest cavity on the right side, each one spaced like the fingers of something very large that had grabbed and held and squeezed. The larger Veil's breathing was wrong, too fast and too shallow, and stopping sometimes in the middle for a beat too long. Reed looked at the hatchling. The small creature was watching him with those silver eyes, and its front claws were pressed together in a grip so tight the knuckles had gone pale beneath the scales. In one claw it held something small and dark. A stone, carved roughly into a shape Reed could not make out from here. The hatchling made a sound, soft this time, just 2 short notes. Then it said something that Reed understood, not because it was in his language, but because some things do not need translation. "Can you fix him?" That was what the sound meant. He knew it the way you know when rain is coming. Something in the way the hatchling leaned forward, the way its eyes moved between Reed and the wounded Veil, the way it had dragged something 3 times its own size across a jungle at night to reach a lit room with a human in it. Reed had no protocols for this. He had no database entry. He had no supervisor to call at 3 in the morning who would know what to do. He had bandages, a sensor, a general surgery kit built for 5 known species, and 8 months of field medicine in a posting that had not asked much of him until right now. He looked at the large Veil bleeding on his floor. He looked at the hatchling. He said, quietly and with more certainty than he actually felt, "I'm going to try." He pulled his communicator and sent a single message to Win Akafer's quarters 3 buildings over. 2 words, "Come now." Then he put the communicator away and got to work. The hatchling moved to the large veil's side and pressed its small body there, and did not move from that spot. It held the carved stone against its chest with both front claws and watched Reed, with the focused attention of something that had decided to trust and was not going to look away for a single second. Outside, the jungle made its sounds. The speaker played its slow music. Reed worked. When Akafer arrived with her coat on inside out and her datapad clutched in one hand like a weapon. She was a xenobiologist who had spent 11 years studying creatures the Coalition had not properly named yet. She was not easy to surprise. She stopped inside the doorway and looked at the large veil on the floor, and the small hatchling pressed against its side, and Reed kneeling in the middle of it, all with blood on his gloves. She said one quiet word that was not suitable for official reports. Then she stepped over the threshold and said, "What do you need?" That was one of the things Reed valued most about Win. She skipped the part where she stood there listing reasons why something was impossible. She asked what was needed, and then she went and got it. "Everything you have on Veil biology," Reed said without looking up. "Respiratory system if you can find it, internal organ layout, anything." Win was already pulling up her datapad. "The survey records are partial. The team that was here before us only had 6 weeks before funding was cut. Partial is better than nothing. I have sketches, hand-drawn sketches, Reed." "Then I need those sketches." She pulled a stool to the far counter and started searching. Reed worked around her. He had already managed to slow the bleeding from the 3 puncture wounds using compression techniques he had learned for deep tissue injuries in large mammals. It was not a perfect match. The veil's tissue was denser than anything in his training references, and the wounds went at an angle he had to adjust for twice. But the blood, if that was the right word for the dark fluid, was slowing. The hatchling had not moved. It watched Reed's hands with complete attention. When Reed shifted position and reached past it for a supply pack, the hatchling did not flinch back. It moved slightly aside to give him room, and then settled again beside the large veil's head. Reed noticed that it kept making a soft, low sound, not distress, something steadier than that, almost rhythmic. He filed that away and kept working. The doors opened again at 3:40 in the morning. Counselor Purra was the senior coalition official assigned to the outpost. She was Orin, which meant she had 6 limbs, a flat triangular head, and compound eyes that picked up light differently than human eyes did. She was always calm. Reed had initially found that quality reassuring. He had since learned that Purra's calm was not the same as warmth. She stood at the entrance to the bay and took in the scene without visible reaction. "I received the medical alert," she said. Her voice came through the translation collar at her throat in flat, even tones. "What is the status?" "Still working," Reed said. "This creature is not listed under Coalition Medical Priority Classification." "I know. The protocols are clear. Non-priority fauna are to be observed, not treated." "The protocols," Reed said, pressing a sealed patch over the deepest wound, "were written by someone who was not in this room at 3 in the morning." Purra was quiet for a moment. "The resource expenditure is not sanctioned." "I understand that." "Reed." "He's still breathing, Counselor." Reed did not look up. "That means I'm still working." Another silence. Reed could feel Purra's compound eyes on the back of his neck. He did not turn around. He heard her take 1 step forward, pause, and then step back. "I will note this in my report," she said. "That's fine," Reed said. "Close the door on your way out if you don't mind." The door closed. Wynne looked at him from across the room. She was not smiling exactly, but something in her expression had shifted. She turned back to her datapad and kept searching. 20 minutes later, she said quietly, "Reed, come look at this." He moved to her side. She had found it buried in a subfolder of the pre-coalition survey, a field biologist's personal notes, scanned and uploaded and then apparently forgotten by whoever had archived them. The handwriting was small and quick. The sketches were rough but detailed. Veil anatomy, internal, 3 views. The researcher had labeled everything they could figure out and left question marks on the rest. It was not complete. It was not clean. It was the most useful thing Reed had seen in the last hour. He looked at it for 30 seconds, memorizing the layout of the major structures, noting which parts lined up with what his general sensor had already told him. Then he said, "Can you project that on the bay screen? Larger." "Already doing it," Wynne said. The sketch appeared on the wall screen, blown up to half a meter wide. Reed went back to the veil on the floor. He adjusted his approach to the third wound based on what the sketch showed him about the angle of the inner cavity wall. The hatchling made its low sound again. Wynne said softly from behind her datapad, "That sound it keeps making. I think it might be deliberate. There are notes here about veil producing low harmonic tones in social bonding situations. The researcher thought it might have a physiological component, something to do with nerve response." Reed processed that while he worked. "You mean the sound is doing something to the big one?" "Possibly. The notes are incomplete." Reed looked at the hatchling. It looked back at him. Then it looked at its brother and made the sound again. The large veil's breathing evened out by a fraction. "Keep going," Reed told it, not knowing if it understood. It kept going anyway. 12 hours in, the large veil stopped breathing. Not fully, not finally, but the secondary respiratory system, which Wynne had identified from the old survey sketches as a backup structure behind the primary lung cavity, collapsed without warning. One moment the sensor showed a doubled rhythm, slow and labored but present. The next moment half of it was gone. Reed heard the change before the sensor told him. He had been listening to this creature breathe for 12 hours. He knew its rhythm the way you know a familiar song, well enough to hear when a note drops out. He moved fast. He did not have the right tools. He had never done this before. He had a set of instruments designed for 5 species that were not this one, and a hand-drawn sketch on a wall screen, and 12 hours of watching a creature's body try to keep itself alive. That was what he had. He adapted a technique he had used once on a methane-breathing avian patient during his 2nd year of fieldwork. The avian had 2 chest cavities that operated independently. The veil was not the same, but the logic was close enough to try. He modified the approach in 3 ways based on the sketch, guessing on 2 of them, and applied it. It should not have worked. It partially worked. The secondary rhythm came back, faint and uneven, but there. Like a fire, you have almost lost that catches again on a piece of bark you did not expect to still be dry. Wynne let out a breath from across the room that she had clearly been holding for some time. Counselor Purra was in the doorway again. Reed did not know when she had arrived. She stood very still with her 6 limbs arranged in the closed posture that Orin used when they were watching something they had already made a decision about. She said nothing. She watched. Reed did not look at her. He kept his eyes on his patient and his hands on his instruments, and he kept working. It was Sorrow who gave them the next piece of information. Reed had started thinking of the hatchling as Sorrow. He did not know if that was the creature's name, but it had introduced itself at some point during the 6th hour, making a specific sound and touching its own chest. Reed had tried to repeat the sound. He had gotten it wrong enough that Wynne tried to hide a smile. The hatchling had made a shorter version of the sound, simplified, as if it had decided to meet him partway. Sorrow was close enough. Sorrow had been making the low harmonic tones continuously for 12 hours. Its voice had grown rough. It had not stopped. In the 13th hour it shifted the tone, not by much, just a half step down and slightly slower, and the large veil, its brother who had shown almost no voluntary response since arriving, moved its head, just slightly, just enough. Wynne was watching the sensor readings. She said very quietly, "Reed, his cortisol equivalent just dropped." Reed looked up. How much? Enough to matter. The harmonic tone is doing something neurological, not just calming, something more specific. The nervous system is responding to it. Reed looked at Sorrow. Sorrow was watching its brother's face with every piece of attention it had. What note is most effective? Reed asked. Wynne pulled the audio sensor reading and found the frequency. She hummed it once, softly, to demonstrate. Reed crossed the room and sat beside Sorrow. He hummed the note. Off-key, imprecise, deeply human and imperfect, but close. Sorrow turned its silver eyes to him. Something moved in that gaze that Reed could not name. Then the hatchling shifted its own tone to match, or nearly match, pulling toward the frequency Reed had offered like it was trying to build a bridge from both sides at once. The sensor reading shifted again. Darrow's, which was Reed's best approximation of the older Vale's name based on what Sorrow had called him during the night, settled slightly deeper into whatever passed for rest in a Vale body. Reed went back to the wounds. In the 14th hour, Sorrow showed him something it had been holding since it arrived. Reed had noticed the carved stone before, but had not had a moment to look closely. Sorrow placed it carefully on the floor in front of Reed and stepped back. It was small, dark gray, smooth on one side and carved on the other. The carving was simple. A large shape and a small shape, side by side, the large one curved slightly inward around the small one. Reed looked at it for a long time. Darrow's made that, he said, not a question. Sorrow made a single low note. Agreement or close enough. Reed set it carefully back in front of Sorrow. The hatchling picked it up and held it against its chest again. In the 15th hour, Purra came fully into the room for the first time. She walked to the counter where Wynne had her notes spread out, looked at everything, and then turned to Reed. You have used supplies allocated for the next quarter, she said. Yes, Reed said. I will need to document this. I know. Reed, you understand that there is no framework for what you are doing. Reed applied a new sealing compound to the edge of the first wound, which had started to slowly reopen. He pressed carefully and held. I'm building one, he said. Purra looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Sorrow, who was looking back at her with those wide silver eyes and the carved stone held in both front claws. Purra left. Reed held the wound and counted. He did not stop. Hour 22 felt different from the inside. The outpost had gone quiet. Most of the researchers had heard something was happening in the medical bay, and a few had come to look through the small window in the door before deciding it was not their business and going back to sleep. The jungle outside had settled into its deep night sounds. Lower, slower, like even the wilderness took a breath between midnight and dawn. Wynne was asleep at her workstation with her head on her arms and her datapad still lit beneath her cheek. Reed had tried to wake her an hour ago, and she had said she was just resting her eyes and then said nothing further. He let her sleep. She had given him everything useful she had, and her body had made the decision without asking her permission. Reed worked alone. Darrow's was stable. That word felt thin when he used it. Stable the way a bridge is stable when half the supports are gone but the remaining ones are holding. Every 20 minutes the sensor showed something that made Reed adjust something else. A pressure drop here, a temperature reading that wandered, a wound edge that wanted to pull open. He stayed ahead of it barely, the way you keep a small boat pointed into waves you cannot stop but can at least face directly. He talked. It was a habit he had developed early in his career, before the quiet postings, back when he had worked emergency intake at a coalition transfer station, and patients came in alone and frightened, and not always in a state to hear words but needing them anyway. He had talked through every procedure, not explaining exactly, just filling the space between silence and fear with something human. He talked to Darrow's now. He talked about Earth. He had grown up in a coastal region where the land ended in tall, pale cliffs, and the sea below was cold and green. He told Darrow's about the sound those cliffs made in winter when the wind came off the water and hit the rock face and broke into something between a howl and a song. He told him about snow, the weight of it, The way it made the world go soft and quiet, the particular silence that lived inside a snowfall. He did not know if Darrows heard any of it. He talked anyway. Sorrow listened to all of it. The hatchling was awake, or at least its eyes were open, which Reed had stopped assuming was the same thing. It sat with its back against its brother's side, and its front claws folded in its lap around the carved stone, and it watched Reed the way very young things sometimes watch adults when they are trying to understand the shape of the world. At some point it asked him something. Reed could not understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. A question, genuine, curious, not urgent. Reed looked at it. What do you want to know? Sorrow made a sound, and then touched its own throat with one claw, and then gestured toward Darrows. Reed thought about that for a moment. Why do I keep talking to him even though he can't answer? Sorrow made the short note that meant yes. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because talking is how we hold on. When we go quiet, things feel more gone. When we keep talking, it's like telling the other person they are still here, still real, still worth talking to. Sorrow considered this with the gravity that it brought to everything. Then it turned to Darrows and made a long series of soft clicking sounds. Private, not aimed at Reed. Just the hatchling talking to its brother in its own language for its own reasons. Reed went back to work. At hour 23, Pura arrived again with a formal coalition document recommending cessation of unauthorized cross-species intervention. Reed read the top half of it, which was enough to understand the rest, and set it beside Wynn's sleeping form. I'll look at it in the morning, he said. Reed. In the morning, Pura. She looked at him. Then she looked at Sorrow, who was watching her steadily, not shrinking from anything. Pura set the document on the counter herself and left. In the 24th hour, the sensor numbers moved. Reed almost missed it. He had been adjusting the thermal wrap he had built for Darrows. Several heating panels stripped from storage units and lashed together into something that looked nothing like medical equipment, but functioned well enough to hold Darrow's core temperature in the range the survey sketches suggested was correct. He glanced at the sensor and stopped. The numbers were higher, fractionally, but upward. He stared at the screen for a full minute. He checked the calibration. He ran the scan again. Still higher. Reed sat down on the floor next to Darrows, just for a moment. He put his back against the examination table and let himself exist in the space between one breath and the next. Sorrow looked at him. Reed looked at Sorrow. Neither of them said anything. It did not need words. Hour 36 began like all the others. Quiet, sensor readings, small adjustments. Then Darrows opened his eyes. Not slowly, the way it happens in stories, with a gradual return to the world and soft focus and time to prepare. He opened his eyes the way something large and wild wakes from pain. Fast, fully, with complete awareness and absolutely no idea where he was. Reed had 1 second to react. He stepped back from the table, not out of fear, though the instinct was there, but because he had learned in his first year of field medicine that when a patient woke disoriented, the worst thing you could do was loom over them. He stepped back, opened his hands so both palms were visible, and kept his voice low and even. Easy, he said. Easy, you are safe, your brother is here. Darrows was large. Lying down he was manageable. Sitting up, which he tried to do in the first 3 seconds, he was something else entirely. His wingspan alone would have taken out the supply shelf on the left wall. Reed watched him start to rise and then stop, stopped by the pain that came with the movement, and that pause was enough. Because Sorrow was already moving. The hatchling had been asleep, genuinely asleep this time, curled in the corner on a folded thermal blanket Reed had put there without making a point of it. It came awake the instant Darrows moved. Not startled, certain, as if some part of it had been listening even in sleep for exactly this. It crossed the room in 4 running steps and pressed itself against Darrow's side and made the harmonic sound, not the low, steady version from the long hours of the night, but something faster and higher and unmistakably glad. Darrows went still. He looked at Sorrow, just looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound Reed had never heard from either of them before, something deep that came from low in the chest and moved through the room like the first note of something much larger. Sorrow made it back. Reed stood against the far wall with his hands in his pockets and let it happen. Wynne was awake. She had woken when Darrows moved, and she was recording on her datapad with shaking hands and wet eyes, and trying to look professional about both things. After a while, Darrows turned his head and looked at Reed. It was a long look, unhurried. Reed had been looked at by a lot of patients over the years in a lot of states of consciousness and need, and this was different from all of them. There was weight to it. Darrows was not evaluating him the way a frightened creature evaluates a threat. He was looking at him the way you look at something you are trying to understand the full shape of. Reed met the look. He did not look away. After a while he said, "You had 3 deep puncture wounds through your right chest cavity. Your secondary respiratory system collapsed around hour 12. Your core temperature dropped twice. You have been unconscious for 36 hours and your brother has not moved more than 2 meters from your side the entire time." Darrows listened to this, or at least he was still and his eyes were on Reed while Reed said it. "You are not fixed," Reed added. "You are stable. There is a difference. The next 2 weeks are going to be slow and you are going to have to stay close enough for me to monitor you. I am going to explain this to Sorrow in a moment and let him translate, because my veil vocabulary is about 4 sounds and only one of them is correct." Wynne made a sound that was almost a laugh. Sorrow looked up at Reed with those silver eyes and said something short and questioning. Reed looked at it. "He's going to be okay," he said. "He needs time, but he's going to be okay." Sorrow was quiet. Then it made a sound Reed had not heard before either, something very soft, and tucked its head briefly beneath Darrow's chin the way a much smaller creature might. Darrows curved his neck down around the hatchling. Purra arrived at the door 20 minutes later. She took in the scene without moving. Darrows awake, Sorrow pressed against his side, Reed updating his notes at the counter, Wynne still recording with professional composure held together by determination alone. Purra was still for a long time. Then she said, "I will need to revise my report." "That's fine," Reed said without looking up. She stepped fully into the room for the first time in 36 hours. She looked at Darrows. Darrows looked back at her with those unhurried eyes. Purra's 6 limbs moved through a slow arrangement that Reed had never seen from her before. "What does that mean?" he asked Wynne quietly. "The limb position." Wynne checked her notes. "I think it is an Orin acknowledgement gesture," she said, "used when something has exceeded your expectations." Reed nodded and went back to his notes. Later, when Wynne had finally gone to eat something and Purra had left to rewrite 3 weeks of formal documentation, Darrows lowered his head until his snout was level with Reed's chest and exhaled. One long, slow breath offered forward. Reed understood without knowing how that this meant something. He placed one hand on the side of Darrow's jaw. "Don't mention it," he said quietly. "Really, my paperwork is already a disaster." 3 weeks later, the veil had not left. Nobody had asked them to. Nobody had tried. Even Purra, whose revised report now occupied 11 pages and contained several phrases Reed suspected she had never written before in her career, had made no formal move to relocate them. Darrows and Sorrow had settled at the edge of the tree line, where the jungle met the outpost's outer wall, close enough that Reed could see them from the medical bay window when he looked up from his work. He looked up often. Darrows was not fully healed. His right side still moved stiffly, and Reed monitored him every other day with a portable sensor and a communication method that had evolved, over 3 weeks, into something that worked if you did not examine it too closely. Reed pointed. Darrows held still. Sorrow translated everything else with clicks and gestures and an ever-expanding bridge of shared sounds. The coalition reprimand had arrived by official transmission on the 9th day. It was 3 pages long, formally worded, and listed every supply item Reed had used without authorization. He had read it carefully, noted that the language was precise but contained no actual disciplinary action beyond the reprimand itself, and pinned it to the wall above his supply counter. Wynne thought that was funny. She had signed the appeal anyway. What had changed, in the small and daily ways that mattered more than documents, was sorrow. The hatchling came to the medical bay every morning. Reed had not invited this and had not discouraged it. It simply happened, the way some things do when a connection has been made and neither side sees a reason to undo it. Sorrow would arrive when the light outside was still low and pink, and it would find a spot near the door and watch Reed work. It had learned words, not many, but specific ones. It had learned "what is this" and "show me and I can help." It had learned the word for a sealed wound patch and the word for the portable sensor and the word for the small tool Reed used to check pressure readings in soft tissue. It held things when Reed needed a third hand. It stayed still when staying still was what was needed. It was learning to be useful, and it was very serious about this. On the 22nd day, a new patient arrived. He was an Orin worker from a deep survey mining operation 2 kilometers into the jungle. A rockfall had caught him, and his left upper limb was broken in 2 places, and there was a compression injury along his thoracic structure that the Coalition's standard Orin medical protocol addressed only partially. The protocol had been written for a medical facility with full equipment. Reed had a field bay and a portable sensor, and a supply kit that was already missing several line items due to a certain 3-day emergency he had run 3 weeks prior. He adapted. He always adapted. He found the edges of the protocol where it did not quite fit, and he worked around them the same way he had been working around impossible things for 8 months on this moon, and 11 years before that. Sorrow watched all of it. When Reed was midway through stabilizing the thoracic compression, using a brace configuration he was inventing as he went based on what the sensor showed him and what his hands told him the tissue needed, he heard the hatchling move. He did not look up. His hands were occupied. But then Sorrow spoke. Not in clicks, in words. 2 of them, rough-shaped and careful, the way something sounds when it has been practiced quietly many times before being said out loud. I help. Reed glanced sideways. Sorrow was standing close enough to be useful, with its front claws held forward and open in the posture Reed used when he was demonstrating that his hands were available. It was watching the Orin patient with that focused silver gaze that it turned on everything it was trying to understand. Reed looked at it for 1 second, then he said, "Hold this. Right here, steady pressure, don't move it." Sorrow held it steady, still. Reed finished the brace. Afterward, when the Orin worker was sedated and resting and Wynne had come to sit with him, Reed stepped outside the bay for a moment. The air on Vareth 9 was warm and thick with green. Darrow's was at the tree line, head resting on the top of the outer wall, watching the way he always watched, patient and unhurried. Sorrow came and stood beside Reed. It looked up at him. Then it looked at the door of the medical bay. Then it looked back at Reed and asked the question again, the same one it had asked on the first night in a language Reed had not spoken, but the same question, and this time it came out in words he understood. Can you fix him again? Reed looked at the hatchling. He thought about what it was really asking, not just about the Orin worker inside, about all of it, about whether the night Sorrow had dragged its brother through a jungle and through a door and found a human still awake and working was luck, or whether it was something true, something that would happen again and again because of what humans were and what they did when someone needed them. Reed turned back toward the door. Yeah, kid, he said quietly, that's kind of what we do. Inside, the music from Earth played on a battered speaker. Outside, the jungle breathed. Darrows watched over the wall. Sorrow followed Reed through the door. The galaxy had not planned for any of this. It rarely did.